January 8, 1989, a routine one-hour flight from London to Belfast. A brand-new Boeing 737-400, the pride of British Midlands Fleet, 126 souls on board. Everything is normal until 30 minutes later, when it isn't, an explosion. At violent shudder, flames erupting from one of the engines, the pilots have seconds to react. A critical decision is made, but in the heat of the moment, they shut down the wrong engine. The only working engine was just turned off, and now the plane is falling. The pilots fight to regain control, desperately aiming for an emergency landing at East Midlands Airport. They won't make it. 47 people lost their lives. But this wasn't just an accident. That IT was a failure of technology, a breakdown in human judgment, and a disaster that should have never happened. How did two experienced pilots make such a catastrophic mistake? Was this an issue of poor training, a design flaw in the aircraft? Or was this disaster entirely preventable? January 8, 1989, one of the busiest airports in the world, London Heathrow, is alive with movement. Among the many flights scheduled that evening is British Midland Flight 092, a short, one-hour trip from London to Belfast. Nothing unusual. Nothing to be concerned about. Passengers board, expecting nothing more than a quick, uneventful flight. This was not just any aircraft. Flight 092 was operating on a brand-new Boeing 737-400, a state-of-the-art jet that had only been in service for 5 months. It was the latest upgrade in the Boeing 737 series. Faster, more efficient, equipped with powerful new CFM56 engines designed for better performance and fuel economy. British Midland had just begun integrating this aircraft into their fleet, and Flight 092 was among its routine routes. The crew, experienced but new too. This aircraft, commanding the flight that evening, Captain Kevin Hunt, a highly experienced pilot with over 13,200 flight hours, a trusted veteran of British Midland Airways, his first officer, David McClelland, a skilled co-pilot with 3,300 hours of experience. Both men were competent, well-trained, and fully qualified for the job, but there was one critical detail, one that no one paid much attention to at the time. Neither of them had extensive experience. With the Boeing 737-400, they had only flown it a few times. Their training had covered only the basics, and in the chaos that would soon unfold, that inexperience would cost lives. The takeoff, a smooth departure at 7:52 p.m., British Midland Flight 092 lifts off from Heathrow Airport. The takeoff is smooth. The climb is steady. Everything appears routine. At 28,000 feet, the aircraft cruises effortlessly toward its destination. There's no turbulence, no sign of trouble. Passengers relax. Some sip drinks. Others glance at newspapers up in the cockpit. The pilots settle into cruise mode. Nothing out of the ordinary. But what no one realizes is that this peaceful flight will soon take a terrifying turn. And at 8:05 p.m., everything will change. Something has just gone terribly wrong. No one on board knows it yet, but Flight 092 has just entered the most critical moment of its existence. And the decisions made in the next few minutes will determine who lives and who doesn't. For the first 13 minutes of the flight, everything was normal. Flight 092 was cruising at 28,000 feet, making its way to Belfast with no delays. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, offering drinks. Some passengers had already dozed off. Others flipped through magazines. Nothing seemed out of place in the cockpit. Captain Hunt and First Officer McClelland monitored the instruments. They discussed upcoming weather conditions, their expected arrival time. It was a routine flight, in every sense, but what no one realized was that time was running out. A loud bang echoes through the cabin. At 8:05 p.m., a violent explosion rocks the aircraft. The calm, peaceful flight is shattered in an instant. Something has gone wrong, very wrong. The right engine is failing inside the cabin. Passengers exchange nervous glances. Some feel the vibration beneath their feet, but there's no announcement from the cockpit. Not yet. And then, a second jolt. The aircraft shudders again, dipping slightly before stabilizing. Now, everyone knows something is wrong. Passengers look to the flight attendants. The flight attendants look to the cockpit. And in the cockpit, Captain Hunt and First Officer McClelland are facing a critical decision. A warning flashes, a vibration alert. The right engine is struggling. But then, another issue arises. The data isn't clear, it's not behaving like a normal engine failure. And in the next few moments, the pilots will make a decision that will change everything. A decision is coming. A decision that will determine the fate of everyone on board. The tension inside Flight 092 was rising. The aircraft was still airborne, but something wasn't right. In the cabin, nervous passengers exchanged glances. Some clutched their armrests a little tighter, waiting for an announcement that never came. In the cockpit, Captain Kevin Hunt and First Officer David McClellan stared at their instruments, trying to make sense of the situation. They were trained professionals, each with thousands of flight hours, but at this moment, they faced an emergency unlike anything they had encountered before. The explosion had been violent. The aircraft had trembled under its force. The right engine had spewed flames. But now, the cockpit readings showed something unexpected. The vibration warnings were flickering, erratic. The instruments weren't giving them a clear answer. Hunt turned to McClellan. They both knew what had to happen. Next, if an engine was failing, it needed to be shut down before it caused more damage. The safety of the aircraft depended on it. But which engine was failing? McClellan hesitated, his eyes scanning the display. Hunt made his decision. Shutdown number 1. McClellan reached forward. His fingers gripped the throttle control for the left engine, the only fully operational engine on the aircraft. And he pulled it back. The silence, the hum of the engine, the steady force keeping them aloft, faded, but the aircraft was still shaking, still struggling. Then, a realization, creeping in too late. They had shut down the wrong engine. For a few seconds, nothing happened. The aircraft still moved forward. But then, as if the sky itself had changed, Flight 092 began to descend. In the cabin, a woman gasped. A businessman gripped the tray table in front of him. A mother held her child a little closer. The flight attendants were still standing there, hands on the seats for balance, their faces now betraying the first traces of real fear. In the cockpit, Hunt and McClellan exchanged glances. Their training told them that a controlled descent was possible with one working engine, but they had just taken that option away. And now, they were falling. The altimeter ticked downward, 27,000 feet, 26,000, 25. Hunt's mind was racing. Could they restart the engine? Was there time? But restarting an engine at altitude wasn't like turning on a car. It wasn't instant. It required time they didn't have. Ahead, the lights of East Midlands Airport were visible in the distance, a beacon of safety, a chance. If they could just hold on a little longer, but gravity was pulling them down. The aircraft shuddered again. The right engine, the damaged engine, was still running, but barely. The failing machinery groaned under the weight of the aircraft, struggling to produce enough power to keep them in the air. In the cabin, the passengers had stopped talking. Some were whispering prayers. Others simply stared at the floor, gripping their seats. The realization was setting in. The pilots had made a fatal mistake, and now they were running out of sky. The ground was coming closer, faster, and East Midlands Airport was still too far away. Inside the cockpit, Captain Hunt's voice was tight, his breath shallow. He gripped the controls, fighting to keep the aircraft level, but deep down, he knew they weren't going to make it, and in less than 2 minutes, the world would know it too. The situation inside British Midland Flight 092 had shifted from urgent to catastrophic. The aircraft was still in the air, but it was no longer flying. It was falling. The pilots had made a devastating miscalculation. The only fully operational engine had been shut down. The right engine, which had already suffered catastrophic failure, was the only thing still barely keeping them aloft. And now, it wasn't enough. The aircraft was losing altitude at an alarming rate: 10,000 feet, 8,000 feet, 6,000 feet. The bright lights of East Midlands Airport were now in sight, tantalizingly close. But deep inside the cockpit, Captain Kevin Hunt and First Officer David McClellan were facing the brutal reality. There wasn't enough time. They were too low, too slow, and the ground was rising to meet them. The crew still had one option left. A desperate one. McClellan reached forward and restarted the left engine. It coughed, it sputtered. Then, against all odds, it came back to life. For a brief moment, there was hope. The aircraft's descent slowed ever so slightly. But it was still too late. They had lost too much altitude. The power wasn't enough. To regain their approach, Hunt and McClellan knew this flight was no longer about landing safely. It was about survival. In the distance, a stretch of road appeared. The M1 motorway, a busy highway, filled with cars. Their only option, 8:24 p.m. The roar of the failing engines filled the night sky. Motorists on the M1 motorway looked up, just in time to see a Boeing 737 hurtling toward them. Some hit their brakes. Others swerved. A few had no time to react at all. Inside the cockpit, Hunt pulled back on the controls, doing everything in his power to soften the landing. It wasn't enough. The aircraft slammed into the embankment just 900 meters short of the runway. The left wing struck the ground first. The impact ripped through the fuselage like a blade, sending metal and debris flying. The nose collapsed inward, crushing the front section of the plane. The force of the crash split the aircraft into 3 sections, scattering wreckage across the frozen ground. In the cabin, passengers were thrown violently forward. Some remained strapped in their seats. Others were not as lucky. The cockpit, where Hunt and McClellan had fought desperately to save the plane, was completely destroyed on impact. Then, silence. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, the screaming began. The aircraft was shattered, but it wasn't over yet. Inside the twisted metal, survivors began to stir. Some opened their eyes to pure darkness, the cabin lights extinguished. Others struggled against the seats that had crumpled into them. Smoke filled the air, thick and suffocating. Somewhere near the back, a woman's voice screamed for help. Another passenger, dazed, disoriented, felt something warm and wet trickling down his forehead. He touched it. Blood. A man, still conscious, frantically clawed at his seatbelt, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't undo it. The aircraft groaned, settling deeper into the ground. The smell of jet fuel filled the wreckage. They had survived the crash, but now they had to get out. The first emergency call went out within seconds of impact. Fire engines, ambulances, police. The first responders raced toward the wreckage, their sirens cutting through the freezing night. When they arrived, they found an unimaginable scene. A Boeing 737 ripped apart, smoke rising from its shattered remains, and survivors desperately trying to escape. Some had already managed to climb out through the gaps in the fuselage. Others were trapped, pinned between broken seats and twisted metal. Firefighters rushed forward, breaking open what was left of the emergency exits. They worked quickly because they knew what was coming. The jet fuel was leaking. The cockpit audio played back the last moments before disaster. The loud explosion at 8:05 p.m., the violent shaking of the aircraft, the alarms blaring. Then, Captain Kevin Hunt's voice, "Shut down number 1. A silence followed. Investigators stopped the tape, rewound it, played it again. "Shut down number 1. That was it. That was the moment British Midland Flight 092 was doomed, because engine number 1, the left engine, was perfectly fine. The failing engine, the one that was on fire, the one that had suffered catastrophic failure, was number 2, the right engine. But the pilots had shut down the wrong one. Investigators needed to understand why 2 experienced pilots, both highly trained professionals, had made such a fatal error. The answer? It all came down to instinct and a flaw in training. The new Boeing 737-400 cockpit was different. Hunt and McClellan had thousands of hours of experience on the older Boeing 737 models, but the 737-400 was new, and its engine warning system was different. The cockpit indicators didn't provide clear signals about which engine had failed. The vibrations were misleading. The pilots felt strong vibrations coming from the left side. Instinctively, they assumed the left engine had failed, but the vibration wasn't from the left engine. It was from the failing right engine shaking the entire aircraft. They didn't double-check their instruments in a crisis. Pilots are trained to cross-check their instruments before making a major decision. But the 737-400's new engine monitoring system wasn't as intuitive as previous models. Under pressure, they trusted their instincts instead of confirming the data. British Midland Flight 092 had enough power to make it to the airport. Had the pilots left the left engine running, they would have landed safely. But by the time they realized their mistake, it was too late. They had already lost too much altitude. 1 year after the crash, the Air Accidents Investigation Branch released its final report. The primary cause of the accident was officially listed as pilot error. The crew shut down the wrong engine. But the report also highlighted inadequate pilot training. British Midland had not properly trained its crews on the new Boeing 737-400's warning systems, a Boeing design flaw. The aircraft's engine vibration indicators weren't clear enough to help pilots make the right decision. A preventable mechanical failure. The right engine's fan blade had fractured due to a defect, leading to the initial failure. The British aviation industry was shaken. Flight 092 had exposed dangerous gaps in pilot training, and those gaps needed to be closed. New cockpit training procedures were introduced. Pilots were retrained on how to diagnose engine failures properly. Simulator training was redesigned to mimic real-world emergencies more accurately. Boeing updated the 737-400 cockpit systems to make engine failures clearer. And because of these changes, a crash like British Midland Flight 092 never happened again. 47 people lost their lives that night. Not because of terrorism, not because of bad weather, but because of a mistake. One miscalculation, one decision made. In a moment of chaos, one error that cost dozens of lives. Today, every time a pilot trains for an engine failure, they learn from Flight 092. Every time a cockpit crew double-checks their instruments, it's because of the lessons from that night. British Midland Flight 092 never made it to Belfast, but the lives lost weren't in vain, because what happened that night changed aviation forever, and now, the mistakes of the past will never be repeated. The morning after the crash, Britain woke up to tragedy. The smoldering wreckage of British Midland Flight 092 was all over the news. The headlines were brutal: 47 lives lost, 74 injured, a nation in shock. For the families of those who never arrived, the waiting was unbearable. Some had kissed their loved ones goodbye just hours before. Now, they would never see them again. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of any air disaster is that for the families, the moment they hear the news, their world stops. For those who survived, life would never be the same. Many suffered lifelong injuries. Some would never walk again. Others were haunted by memories of that night. The explosion, the screaming, the suffocating smoke, but beyond the physical scars, it was the emotional wounds that cut the deepest. Survivor, softly. I remember holding onto my seatbelt, thinking, this is it. This is how I die. But against all odds, 79 people survived that night, and some of them would go on to change aviation history. The official investigation began immediately. There was no doubt that Flight 092's engine failure was the trigger, but the final cause of the crash? That was far more complicated. Investigators played the cockpit voice recording, and when they heard the pilot's final decision, their blood ran cold. The pilots had shut down the wrong engine. Flight 092 was doomed not by mechanical failure alone, but by human error. But why did they make this mistake? That question would haunt the aviation industry. Journalist, how could two experienced pilots make such a basic mistake? The pressure was intense. British Midland had to answer for training gaps. Boeing had to answer for flawed cockpit designs. The aviation industry had to ensure this never happened again. The official report blamed multiple factors: pilot error, inadequate training on the Boeing 737-400, confusing instrument design. The newer Boeing model had different warning systems, and the pilots, trained on the older version, reacted instinctively instead of correctly. Because of Flight 092, aviation changed forever. New cockpit procedures required pilots to double-check failures. Boeing redesigned warning indicators to be clearer. Engine failure training became mandatory for all pilots flying the 737-400. Because of these changes, a crash like Flight 092 has never happened again. For the families of those lost, no report, no safety reform, no technological upgrade could bring their loved ones back. I lived that night, but I think about those who didn't. Every single day, their loss changed aviation. Their tragedy prevented future disasters, and their memory will never be forgotten. And if a single spark ignited it, there would be no more survivors. The rescuers didn't hesitate. They pulled survivors from the wreckage, working against time, against the growing flames, against the impossible. A firefighter grabbed a young boy, no older than 5, and carried him to safety. A paramedic helped an elderly man, his face streaked with blood, away from the burning wreck. Inside the fuselage, a flight attendant, still alive, still conscious, did what she had been trained to do. She didn't run. Instead, she turned back into the smoke-filled cabin and started pulling passengers out. By the time the last survivor was pulled from the wreckage, the flames had begun to spread. Firefighters fought hard. But for some, it was too late. 47 people lost their lives that night, some on impact, some from their injuries. And yet, 74 survived, not because of luck, but because of the heroism of first responders, passengers, and crew members who refused to leave others behind. By morning, news of the crash spread across the UK. Television screens flashed images of the wreckage, the broken fuselage sitting beside the motorway. Survivors, wrapped in blankets, their faces pale, stood in shock, reliving the nightmare. Families waited for news, hoping for the best. Many received the worst call of their lives, and across the country, one question remained: how did this happen? The aircraft was nearly brand new. The pilots were experienced. There was no extreme weather. So, why did Flight 092 fall out of the sky? The answers lay inside the black boxes, and what investigators found would be even more shocking than the crash itself. The wreckage of British Midland Flight 092 smoldered in the cold January morning. Investigators from the Air Accidents Investigation Branch, AIB, arrived on site. Their mission was simple: find out what went wrong. But they already knew one thing. This was not an ordinary plane crash. This was a failure of judgment, of training, and perhaps of technology itself. And the truth? It was buried inside two small black boxes. The cockpit voice recorder, CVR, and flight data recorder, FDR, were quickly retrieved from the wreckage. These devices held every sound, every decision, every movement that had taken place in the cockpit. If there was a mistake, it would be in the recordings. Investigators pressed play, and within minutes, they found it: a single deadly miscalculation.